I'm here to talk tonight about Countess Markievicz's propaganda cartoons in the lead up to and during the Irish Civil War, specifically those in the NLI collection. So this talk, it's based on an article taken aim with her pen, Countess Markievicz's propaganda cartoons, which was in the History Ireland supplement, The Split from Treaty to Civil War. So that was in 2021, just in case anyone's interested in following that up. So in terms of the structure of the talk tonight, I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of Markievicz's kind of her early life and her interest in art. And then putting this into the broader context of the Civil War, I'm going to look briefly at why anti-treaty propaganda was necessary in the first place. I will then devote most of the presentation to examining some of Markievicz's key propaganda cartoons from the NLI collection. And then I'm going to finish briefly by talking a little bit about Markievicz's later life. So in terms of Markievicz's earlier life and her interest in art, Constance Georgina Markievicz was born in February 1868 at Buckingham Gate, London. She was the eldest of 5 children, born to Sir Henry Gore Booth, who was an Anglo-Irish philanthropist and explorer, and his wife Georgina. And she was brought up for the most part in the family house at Lizzadale, County Sligo, and we see a picture of that here. The children were educated at home when they were younger, and they were taught to appreciate music, poetry, and importantly art. And in 1886, they were taken by their governess on a grand tour of the continent. So when she was younger, Markievicz actually had art lessons, and she had lessons from the Irish painter Sarah Purser. And Purser famously painted Markievicz and her sister Eva when they were younger. So Markievicz hoped to study art, but according to her diaries, she faced some strong opposition from her parents, and they initially disapproved of her ambition. Her parents eventually relented in 1893, and this was when Markievicz was in her early 20s, so young adult. And she went to the prestigious Slade School of Art in London, and she studied under the principal Frederick Brown and his assistants Henry Tonks and Wilson Steer. Her time in London may have had an impact on her in terms of broadening her outlook, as on her return to Lizzadale, she took up the cause of women's suffrage, presiding over a meeting of the Sligo Women's Suffrage Society in 1896. She remained interested in art, and in 1898, her parents were persuaded to allow her to go to Paris to enable her to further her studies in art. So it was during her time in Paris that she met a Polish count and fellow art student, Casimir Markievicz. And this is from this marriage is how she would get the Markievicz surname. They were married in London in 1900, and they had a daughter, Maeve, who was born the following year. Upon their return to Ireland, Markievicz and her husband became involved in Dublin's liveliest cultural and social circles. So they exhibited their paintings and they produced an act in a number of plays at the Abbey Theatre. So we see this image to the left of that Markievicz in the centre performing in the play in the Abbey Theatre in 1910. But it was 1908 that had been a pivotal year for her politically. So she joined Sinn Féin, which was a new political organisation. And she also joined Daughters of Ireland, a nationalist women's organisation. And she also helped to found and become a regular contributor to Women of Ireland, which was the first women's nationalist journal in Ireland. And she designed the masthead for this, which you see this image on the right. So this was kind of an early example of her becoming more interested in using art for different means. Around this time, she also took night classes at the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art in 1910. So some scholars, such as R.F. Foster, have noted that art school could have been a radicalising experience somewhat for some. And before and during the war years, the DMSA was highly political. And many of her revolutionaries studied there. Some examples would be Patrick Pearse and his brother William, and also Grace Guilford, who was also interested in art. But in these cases, it was before Markievicz. They would have studied there before Markievicz had arrived, but still her time at the DMSA could have had some kind of impact on her politically, potentially. And over the next few years, Markievicz became increasingly interested in socialism and trade unionism, and she worked tirelessly to help strikers' families during the Dublin lockout of 1913. So, as many will know, it's for the Easter Rising and her role in that Markievicz is most commonly remembered. And on the left, we see her here, a portrait of her in military uniform. So during Easter Rising, Markievicz was famously second in command to Michael Mallon at St. Stephen's Green. And her role in the Rising, it was reported across the world. We see here in this image also from the NLI and the right, sorry. A newspaper front page, a French newspaper front page, which shows Markievicz being taken away after the Rising. So she gained a lot of publicity for this. But following the general surrender of the rebels, she was court-martialed, and she was sentenced to death for a role in the Rising. But this sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life, and this was on account of her gender. And she was released under general amnesty in June 1917. So in 1918, Markievicz was one of the many advanced nationalists who was arrested on account of their alleged involvement in a treasonous German plot, and many people associated with Sinn Féin were arrested as part of this. But this was in some cases despite there being pretty scant evidence. But during her time in Hollowood, when she was in prison, she put her artistic skills to use. So this is one of the cartoons she drew in Hollowood in 1918, Mrs. Piggly Wiggle, a Fronacog, which is interesting. It depicts the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. He was famously Welsh. And the reference to Fronach is also significant, as in the wake of the Rising. This was the name of an internment camp for around 1,800 suspected rebels. And Markievicz often did satirical caricatures of English politicians, and she depicted them as animals in human attire. She'd also done others of Churchill, for example, around this time. So again, it's interesting as it kind of foreshadows the type of propaganda cartoons she would do maybe during the Civil War period. So in 1918, this was another significant year for her. She was the first woman famously to be elected to the British Parliament. But like all the Sinn Féin MPs, she refused to take her seat at Westminster. On her release and return to Ireland in March 1919, she was named Minister for Labour in the First Dáil Éireann, a position that bridged her commitment to Labour and to the fledgling Republic. Such political activity became more dangerous and difficult after the outbreak of the War of Independence in early 1919. And Markievicz spent much of this time on the run and in constant danger of arrest. She was arrested again, for example, in September 1920, and she was sentenced to 2 years hard labour after a long period on remand. She was released eventually in July 1921 in the wake of the truce with Britain, and she returned to her ministry. But any hope of political stability was dashed by the split over the Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921. So many will know that Markievicz was famously very opposed to the treaty, and she was strongly anti-treaty. And in the Dáil on the 3rd of January 1922, when the treaty was being discussed, she made a speech in which she condemned the treaty in the strongest possible terms, stating, "I rise today to oppose with all the force of my will, with all the force of my whole existence, this so-called treaty, this Home Rule Bill covered over with the sugar of a treaty." So basically saying it was nothing more than Home Rule. And she reiterated her advocacy of an Irish Workers' Republic. So during the first 6 months of 1922, the historian Lauren Arrington observed that the struggle between the pro and anti-treaty factions was a war for public opinion. Evidently, propaganda was important to both sides. So the anti-treaty clandestine newspaper Poblack Nairn appeared in print several days before the vote had been taken in the Dáil to decide the fate of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Once the Civil War began, however, the use of propaganda became even more crucial. So between 1922 and 1923, Markievicz produced a number of cartoons which criticised the treaty, leading treaty-out politicians, the National Army, and anyone else associated with the fledgling Free State. And our cartoons also depicted some anti-treaty-out figures as well, which we're going to look at in a minute. But first, I just want to take a few minutes to look at why was anti-treaty propaganda necessary in the first place. So for a couple of reasons. It was necessary to boost anti-treaty morale in the face of Free State military supremacy, particularly with regards to weapons. It was also the case that most mainstream Irish newspapers were pro-treaty. So here we have a map, and it's taken from an article, which is a very interesting article by Donald O'Driscoll, and it shows the positions taken on the treaty by approximately 100 daily and weekly commercial, as distinct from political mouthpiece newspapers, which were published in the 26 counties in January 1922. So it's a very useful map because it really shows it was overwhelmingly pro-treaty, the position that the newspapers, the mainstream papers took. The only ones really that were anti-treaty, we see Red in Ballyshannon, some in Sligo, which is where Markievicz was from, where she was brought up, and some there in Waterford. So really the anti-treatyites would have been aware from the outset that they would need to create their own media outlets if they wanted to have a voice. Newspapers such as the Freeman's Journal, for example, they were also seen by many as an organ of the state, so seen to be biased. So the provisional government also imposed a censorship on the mainstream newspapers. So Piers Beasley, a TD, an editor of the Irish Volunteers newspaper, he largely ran the provisional government's censorship operation. So he issued fairly strict instructions to the press, stating that the anti-treaty forces were always to be referred to as irregulars or armed men. So they were never to be given proper military designation. The pro-treaty forces, on the other hand, were to be referred to as Irish Army or National Army. So there are clearly attempts from the beginning to delegitimise the anti-treaty side. And Markievicz's cartoons were also in some ways a substitute for photographs. So pro-treaty publications such as the Irish Independent, they included almost daily photographs of current affairs. And the National Army, for instance, were generally portrayed in these papers in a positive light. So we see like the soldiers looked respectable and professional, heroic. So Markievicz's cartoons were really an attempt to remedy this. As anti-treaty IRA, they did not have comparable access to photographic publicity. And I think I just wanted to mention here, there's an excellent PhD thesis by Dr. Tim Ellis-Dale, and he'd written about visual culture in the Irish Free State, which is very interesting development here. And there was also some attempts by Republicans to control mainstream newspapers initially, or to censor them as well, like the newspapers like the Cork Examiner, for example. But this was really at the earlier stages, before the Civil War, and in the earlier stages, it became increasingly difficult for the anti-treaty side as they began to lose ground in the military battle, as they began to lose ground to the pro-treaty forces. So as anti-treaty Republicans had much more limited outlets for their work, Markievicz's cartoons, they featured really in clandestine newspapers, and there were several of these, including Poblacht na Éireann. So this was the main anti-treaty newspaper, and the Republican War Bulletin. And as we can see here, sometimes these newspapers, they would have changed names or even been printed in a different country, like we see here, the Scottish edition of Poblacht na Éireann, to try and afford Free State censorship, really. But some attempts were also made to get a wider audience for our work. Indeed, anti-treaty IRA leader Ernie O'Malley later remembered that some of Markievicz's cartoons were pasted on letterboxes and lampposts around Dublin, and they were also circulated by members of Covenant Band. So now I'm going to move on to looking at some of the cartoons from the NLI collection themselves. So aside from references to individual incidents, it's difficult to determine the exact date of the month that some of Markievicz's cartoons were published in. It's noticeable, however, that several of her 1922 cartoons depicted the National or Free State Army. Needless to say, these cartoons were less than flattering. So one rather self-explanatory cartoon we see here on the left, a leaf from the Black and Tan book, suggested that there were parallels or even signs of continuity between the newly created National Army and the Black and Tans, an overwhelmingly British force that had come to be associated with brutality and ill discipline during the War of Independence. And such comparisons were fairly common, anti-treaty slurs against the National Army. And this cartoon on the right, it makes reference to the fact that the Free State Army used British artillery to bombard the forecourts at the start of the Civil War. So we see here, it says here on the right, makes a great sport, he's hammering the Republicans with R18 pounders. So another cartoon printed in the Republican War Bulletin depicted an elderly man trembling at gunpoint during a National Army raid on its home. So the obvious message was the Free State forces were preying on the vulnerable and humiliating those suspected of harbouring or aiding anti-treaty fighters. So evidently, the brutality of the Free State forces was a common theme for Markievicz's work. So arguably, Markievicz's most shocking drawings were the ones that depicted specific Civil War incidents. So Markievicz's illustration of the murders of two senior Fianna Éireann officers, 19-year-old Sean Cole and 21-year-old Alfred, for instance, would have struck a chord with the public, as it closely emulated witnesses' descriptions of the event. At an inquest into their deaths, Alderman Michael Staines claimed that the young men could have been killed by their own side, as he believed that Cole was allegedly about to leave the irregulars, and similar claims were made by other figures. There was some evidence, however, to suggest that the young men had been abducted and murdered by Free State forces, most likely by elements within the Free State Army intelligence and or the notorious plainclothes detective squad, the CID, sometimes known as the O'Reilly House Gang. So in this case, there was no need for Markievicz to choose artistic license in her illustration, as the true horror of the event was only too evident. And for dramatic purposes, she included the biblical quote, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And it's interesting that in the cartoon, she refers to them as Boy Scouts of Fianna Éireann. In reality, they were quite senior figures, but you know, this was, despite this, it was a very brutal event that would have resonated with the public. But just to mention, if anyone's interested in following this up, that this just one cartoon is from a collection outside of the NLI, but I just thought it was significant to mention it. So the other theme of Markievicz's cartoons we're going to look at is depictions of Republican women. So despite Markievicz's belief in gender equality, for propaganda purposes, the female subjects of her cartoons were sometimes relegated to conventional gender roles. So one of her most prominent cartoons, which we see here at a Republican home, depicted a mother and child kissing goodbye to their father before he goes off to fight in the Civil War. And the illustration is reminiscent of British recruitment propaganda during the First World War. And it also depicts a rather harmonious family life, typical family life, at least on the anti-treaty side. Admittedly, this rather stereotypical portrayal of the woman being left at home with the children while her husband goes off to fight would have been accurate in some cases, and it undoubtedly added to the tragedy of the saying. Such gender stereotypes were not, however, consistent with Markievicz' own beliefs. As many will know, she herself actively fought for the Republican cause. For example, she fought during the Rising. Interestingly, several of Markievicz's other Civil War cartoons depicted women, including more prominent figures like Eamon de Valera's wife Sinead, as victims of Free State threat and intimidation. So we see Sinead de Valera here and their children surrounded by the Free State forces, long trench coats and guns. It's interesting because in this cartoon, she's actually portrayed as rather stoically, not looking afraid. But another of Markievicz's cartoons, completely differently, Bodyguard of the Republic. It depicts the figure of Hibernia with her arm around a female anti-treaty combatant, we see on the right, in military uniform. Though it's noticeable an armed male figure on the left is also present. So this image is different than the others, as Markievicz in this case is attempting maybe to emphasize the courage and patriotic nature of anti-treaty women. In this case, they're being portrayed much more militantly. And women were, of course, subjected to violence and intimidation during the Irish Civil War, and more research has been done on this recently. But from a propaganda perspective, it would seem that it sometimes suited Markievicz, perhaps, it could be argued, to play up to certain gender stereotypes in order to emphasize the brutality of the Free State forces. Some historians have argued that from 1922 onwards, there was a change in her focus of her drawings from strong women to helpless women at the hands of the brutal Free State forces. But it's difficult to confirm this, as many of her cartoons don't have specific dates. So now to move on to Markievicz's portrayals of a well-known figure, Michael Collins. So as chairman of the provisional government of the Irish Free State from January 1922 onwards, then commander-in-chief of the National Army, it's perhaps unsurprising that Michael Collins became one of Markievicz's prime targets. And this was despite, or even partly because of his respective revolutionary record. So although Collins claimed that the treaty was a stepping stone to independence, from the anti-treaty point of view, the acceptance of Dominion status was a portrayal of the Republic that had been declared in 1916 and ratified by the Dáil in January 1919. So Markievicz usually depicted Collins in her cartoons as either a traitor to the cause or an unwitting puppet of the British government. So one cartoon, for instance, we see here on the left, depicted Collins, and he's accompanied by W.T. Cosgrave, we see on the right here, President of the Executive Council, and a bishop. And they're holding a gun to the head of the shackled figure of Hibernia, with ordering her to swear allegiance to the king. And this was one of the key kind of sticking points of the treaty. And another cartoon you see here on the right, it depicted Collins and Arthur Griffith, who was one of the treaty signatories and the founder of Sinn Féin. It depicts him sitting on the knee of Winston Churchill, describes him as Churchill's puppets. Interestingly, some of Markievicz's cartoons contain criticisms of Collins, which were slightly less ideologically driven. So one particularly scathing cartoon depicted Collins, which usually depicted him dressed in military uniform, looking down at the coffin of his former friend and fellow revolutionary Harry Boland. So many people will have heard of Harry Boland. He fought in he was in the IRB, fought in the Easter Rising. He'd accompanied de Valera to America, and he took the anti-treaty side during the Civil War. So he'd been on opposite sides to Collins, and they had at one time been friends. But the image would have struck a chord with the public, as Boland had been shot under questionable circumstances on the 30th of July 1922 during a raid by Free State troops at the Grand Hotel in Cary, and he died in hospital 2 days later. But despite the tragedy of the situation, Markievicz's caricature of Collins is accompanied by a caption that reads, "What will the Morning Post think of me now?" So the obvious implication being that Collins was primarily concerned with the potential damage to his reputation of how he was being portrayed, perhaps by the media. And Markievicz's specific reference to the Morning Post, a respectable British newspaper, is also significant, as it had a primarily upper and middle class readership. So it seemed then that Markievicz was mocking Collins' newfound respectability and maybe acceptance by certain high society circles in Britain and Ireland. She also seemed to be suggesting that Collins was primarily motivated by social climbing ambitions, and we'll see she makes similar criticisms later about other politicians, and perhaps a desire for respectability. And another cartoon for the Free Staters an action series. It depicts a Free State soldier in uniform with a glass of beer in his hand and a bottle. So again, it's implying ill discipline, drunkenness, and the caption reads, "What's good enough for Mick Collins is good enough for me." And an anti-treaty criticism was that many people supported the treaty because Collins had agreed to it, that they blindly follow Collins. And sometimes there is something to this. Sometimes that was the case, but it was not always the case, obviously. Collins was not the only treaty-out politician to become a victim of Markievicz's pen. A rather unflattering series of caricatures entitled Free State Freaks have become one of the more well-known examples of Markievicz's work. And as a result of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, treaty-out politicians were often depicted by Markievicz as being controlled by or even enthusiastically supportive of the British government. In one cartoon, for example, the president of the Executive Council, WT, or as she refers to him, Comic Cosgrave, is portrayed sitting on a throne in a jester suit. He's got a Union Jack in his left hand. Beneath the surface, however, some of Markievicz's cartoons contain slightly more subtle criticisms of the politicians, which are based more firmly on their supposedly newfound wealth and social status. So this cartoon depicts Andy Cope, and he was the assistant undersecretary at Dublin Castle as a puppet master who's literally pulling the strings of the Free State politicians. So if we look at these figures along the top, left to right, Kevin O'Higgins, Minister for Home Affairs at that time. We've got W.T. Cosgrave with a top hat on his left hand and a sign holding his annual salary on the right. We've got Ernest Blythe, Minister for Finance. And then with a key, we've got Phil Cosgrave, who was the brother of W.T. And Governor of Mountjoy prison for a time. So W.T. has been portrayed with a top hat in his hand. And whilst Cosgrave and some of the other government ministers did sometimes wear a top hat on formal occasions, it could be argued the inclusion of the hat encourages the public to forge a link between Cosgrave's apparent subservience to British fashion and, from the British point of view, from the anti-treaty point of view, his subservience to the British Crown. Moreover, the top hat is a fashion accessory commonly associated with respectability and privilege. So given Markievicz's own privileged background, the criticism may seem ironic, but as a committed socialist and anti-treaty, Markievicz was eager to promote the idea the government ministers were overpaid and out of touch with ordinary people. So I suppose this is similar to criticisms across the world that people make of politicians today. And despite the fact that several government ministers had previously taken up arms to fight for Irish independence, like Cosgrave had fought in 1916, for example, several of her cartoons suggest that the treaty-out politicians were motivated by personal ambition and financial gain rather than deep political beliefs. And we see this example, a rather unflattering caricature of Ernest Blythe, for instance, makes a clever pun on his forename, earning in Irish. And the accompanying caption reads, "I'm Blythe, for my salary is worth earning." So again, suggesting he's only interested really in making money. So we just looked at portrayals of the Free State Army and treaty-out politicians. But Markievicz also depicted the anti-treaty side in her cartoons. So this cartoon, True to the Republic, it depicts an anti-treaty prisoner waving a handkerchief for the bars of a prison cell. And by the end of the Civil War, there's something in the region of 12,000 anti-treaty-outs and their supporters interned. And many remained in prison, and the internees went on hunger strike in November 1923 after the Civil War, including Markievicz herself. So the cartoon depicts the prisoners suffering. It also emphasised from the anti-treaty side their principles as they are true to the Republic. So again, this is Markievicz attempting to gain sympathy and support for the anti-treaty side. There are also hints at underlying economic motives behind some of the Free State government's policies. So in this cartoon, we see a mother with a child in her lap and two of her children beside her, and they look fearfully up at the head of Piers Beasley, who was the chief of the press censorship department during the Civil War. And the caption reads, "Dependence funds, will you allow the wives and children of dead and imprisoned Republicans to starve?" Because the Free State censor, Piers Beasley, has suppressed the appeals sent to daily papers. So the Irish Republican Prisoners' Dependence Funds aim to provide support to the wives and children of those who've been imprisoned. But as the Free State government refused to let this appeal run in the daily newspapers, the implication is that the wives and children of Republican prisoners were condemned to starvation. So again, in this cartoon, women are being portrayed as the victims, with the children invulnerable. But again, this is at odds with how Markievicz maybe portrayed women in some of her other cartoons. But it's meant to gain an emotive response, I think. It's also important to remember that the Free State Army was a professional army that paid soldiers a wage. By comparison, the anti-treaty IRA was a voluntary and essentially unpaid citizen army. And the idea was they were fighting for a cause without expectation of material reward. In this cartoon, Markievicz pointed to Free State recruitment of demobilised British Army soldiers and other ex-RIC men. So it says the same spotters who in 1920 were hunting down Republicans for British pay are still at work in 1922, hunting down Republicans for Free State pay. So she's denouncing the professional non-Irish character of as she sees it, of the Free State forces. Implication again is that they've been bought financially. And at the bottom, the public are asked if they endorse the Free State's opportunism. Are you on their side? So people don't necessarily think of religion when it comes to Markievicz. She was from a Protestant ascendancy background, but she converted to Catholicism during the Rising, claiming to have had an epiphany. So we looked at this cartoon a bit earlier, but I'm just going to analyse it a bit more. So as I said, it depicts a Catholic bishop beside W.T. Cosgrave and behind Collins, who's holding a gun to the head of the figure of Hibernia. And she's been made to sworn oath of allegiance to the king. So the Catholic hierarchy was fairly solidly pro-treaty, and this had a big impact on public opinion as it lent respectability and legitimacy to the Free State, especially in the earlier years. Markievicz was clearly critical of the role of the Catholic hierarchy in supporting the Free State, and in a cartoon, the bishop advises Hibernia, "Take any oath, my child, that will get you out of your present difficulties." So really implying maybe that they were lacking in principles. And the cartoon also highlights perhaps Markievicz's concerns about the status of women in the Free State at this time, as we see the male politicians they're attempting to subdue Hibernia. So perhaps she's trying to highlight that in the 1920s, Free State was a fairly restricted place for women. And another cartoon related to the Catholic hierarchy, Clerical Smokescreen, as it happened in Sligo. So it depicts a bishop walking out from Belden with Free State troops firing from behind. And there's two flags above the bishop head with the words IRB and Free State on them. So the Countess had strong associations with Sligo, and that's where she was from, as I said. And the Sligo incident refers to the shooting after capture of 6 anti-treaty IRA men by the Free State forces on Belbulben Mountain in September 1922. And this incident was questionable. It was controversial as the men were believed to have surrendered. Also, in a funeral address by Father Costello, he described the Free State as a smokescreen for England in its present work of destruction in Ireland. So this would have resonated with the public, this cartoon at the time. And the drawing might also be seen in the context of a pastoral letter issued by the Irish Catholic hierarchy in October 1922, which forbid access to the sacraments to those Republicans who were active in the Civil War. So really, how successful was Markievicz's propaganda during the Civil War? Well, propaganda, if managed effectively, can play an important role in shaping public opinion in the lead up to and during a conflict. It can be used, for example, to maintain support for a particular cause or to reinforce specific arguments or ideas. It can also be used to maintain morale or to lower the morale of the enemy. Ultimately, it's difficult to deduce whether Markievicz's Civil War cartoons would have had a major impact on public opinion. This is difficult to say. When it came to propaganda, the anti-treaty side were working at a distinct disadvantage from the outset. They had limited outlets from their work, and clandestine newspapers could not compete with the circulation figures of mainstream newspapers, which were generally supportive of the treaty. The distribution of propaganda was a much more precarious task for the anti-treaty side. Moreover, several of the anti-treaty print presses in Dublin were eventually discovered and closed down by government authorities. So in spite of these obstacles, Markievicz's cartoons contributed significantly to the anti-treaty propaganda effort during the Civil War. And these cartoons, along with the work of other anti-treaty propagandists like Erskine Childers, helped to some extent to counteract the generally pro-treaty mainstream press coverage of the Civil War. Moreover, her cartoons helped to highlight and reinforce specific Republican criticisms of anti-treaty politicians, the National Army, and anyone else associated with the fledgling Free State. But the Civil War drew to a close in May 1923. An order to dump all arms had been issued by Frank Aiken, the IRA Chief of Staff, to his anti-treaty forces. And the instruction was accompanied by a general order from Eamon de Valera advising that further sacrifice of life would now be in vain. But what became of Markievicz herself after the Civil War? Markievicz was elected to the Dáil for Dublin South in August 1923, but like other Sinn Féin candidates, refused to take the oath of allegiance to the King and thus disqualified herself from sitting. She was arrested for the last time in November 1923 while attempting to collect signatures for a petition for the release of Republican prisoners. And she went on hunger strike until she and her fellow prisoners were released just before Christmas. Increasingly detached from some former colleagues, she remained committed to the Republican ideal. And in 1925, she established the Republican Players Dramatic Society, which put on dozens of plays in its first year of operation. So she joined Fianna Fáil when it was established, and she stood successfully as a Fianna Fáil candidate for Dublin South at the June 1927 general election. But her spells from imprisonment took a bad toll on her health, which soon began to fail. She was admitted to Sir Patrick Dunn's hospital and declaring that she was a pauper, was placed in a public ward where she died on the 15th of July 1927 due to complications due to appendicitis. She was denied a state funeral, but she had a large funeral nonetheless. It was one of the largest ever seen in Ireland. It's estimated that 300,000 people lined Dublin streets to pay respects. And she was buried in Glasnevin Cemetery. So I just want to add a brief note on some of the collections here that I've discussed from the NLI. So there are many more drawings by Markievicz held by the NLI, but it's too numerous really to mention them all. So this is just a selection. And most of the ones I've highlighted in this talk from the catalogue reference here at the top, PD 3076. But there are also other drawings, for example, like this one, not related to the Civil War. And if you log into the, search the NLI catalogue on the internet, it's a wonderful search engine. You can search for anything and see the cartoons yourself, which is a great resource. So all that's really left for me to say is thanks so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. And if you take away anything, it's to remember Markievicz, not just as a politician or a revolutionary, but also as an artist. Thank you.